All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 4 for our intergovernmental relations class. First off, I apologize for my voice. I am under the weather again, picked up some other type of respiratory thing. So just got over COVID 3 weeks ago, and now I've got something else. So it's been a long winter already. I'm ready for spring, but I think we have a few more weeks before we get to that. So I do apologize if I sound stranger than I normally do. Fortunately, tonight, I think we'll have a shorter session as compared to some of the longer sessions we've had in recent weeks. And we really tonight only have 5 articles that we are going to be covering. 2 of those articles I will be handling, and so I think we probably will be able to make it somewhat of an abbreviated session. Thank you for your essays, your Blackboard discussion, Blackboard, your Canvas discussions. Number 3, I've gone through and reviewed and graded all of those, so thank you very much for that. Your next discussion board essay focuses on some of the information we are going to cover tonight. And if you haven't looked at it yet, I know a couple people have already turned in their discussion, but if you haven't yet looked at it, what I'm asking you to do for number 4 is to select an intergovernmental grant that you are either familiar with or one that you are interested in. And by intergovernmental grant, I'm just looking for some type of a grant that has intergovernmental components to it. So a grant whereby it's the national government interacting with state government, or state government interacting with local government, or national government interacting with local government. But do try and make sure that whatever grant you select, it does have an intergovernmental component to it. And that's basically just what I'm asking for. And then as you discuss that grant, I would then ask that you also talk about some ways in which you could improve on that grant. And so what types of changes would you make to that grant in order to make it either more effective or more efficient? Brian, go ahead.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. In terms of the grant, can it be a settlement?
It can be, as long as it has intergovernmental components. And so as long as it's something that involves more than one level of government.
Awesome. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely.
Professor, I have a question. Are you wanting us to write, write to the grant agency and kind of giving them our thoughts on how the grant can improve? Or are you just wanting us to write our thoughts out to you?
You can just write your thoughts to me. And so it doesn't have to be any specific type of format. You can just, here are some recommendations that I have to make the grant more effective, and just write it as if you're writing it to me.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I see another hand. It says iPhone. So
that's me. I'm driving from LA.
Okay. All right. No worries.
One of the questions I had for the essays, are we supposed to be including like peer-reviewed stuff?
No, not for the discussion boards. You do not have to. If you do have some
the essays,
you want to cite, for the article critiques, yes. For the article critiques, you should include some outside peer-reviewed sources. Usually 2 or 3 will be sufficient, but yes, I do want to see some of those outside sources for the article critiques.
Understood. Thank you.
Sure. And I know several people have already turned in article critique number 1. Some have already turned in article critique number 2 as well. If you haven't turned in either of the article critiques, you might want to give some consideration to doing that in the near future. I know the way in which the course is designed is that it kind of lends itself to a lot of the critiques coming in at the end of the course, because everyone chooses to do articles that we cover on our last session. And I understand that, but you might want to consider getting one of the article critiques turned in before we get to the end of the term. Again, I've had several article critique number 1s have come in, maybe 2 or 3 article critique 2s have come in as well, but consider maybe getting those article critiques turned in sooner as opposed to later. Okay. Where we have been so far is, as you all know, we spent a couple weeks talking about the constitutional foundations of federalism and intergovernmental relations. Then in our last session before winter break, we spent our time talking about the political aspects of intergovernmental relations. And we talked about public interest groups, and we talked about how state and local governments try and lobby Congress. And we talked about how governments, state and local governments cooperate with each other. And we have that article that talked about things such as intergovernmental compacts and multi-state legal action and uniform state legislation. We talked about a lot of aspects of the kind of the political strategies, the political approaches that kind of really characterize our system of intergovernmental relations. This week, we're not going to leave that topic. If you've read the articles, which I hope you have for this week, I'm sure you have seen that many of those articles reference a lot of the topics we talked about in our last session before break. Where a lot of these articles look at grants as kind of being creatures of our political system. But tonight, the primary topic will be fiscal federalism, the fiscal aspects of intergovernmental relations, which is one of my favorite topics. And I think since the 1930s, since the New Deal, much of this relationship between national, state, and local governments certainly has been characterized by federal grants and aid. And so we have a few articles tonight that we will be discussing that touch upon that topic. We have the break article, Economics of Intergovernmental Grants, which belongs to Taylor. We have the Moneypenny article, Federal Grants and Aid, that belongs to Nancy. The Spraja article, due to some scheduling changes, that one we're not going to cover tonight. We're going to push the Spraja article until January 24th. So if you did want to do an article critique on the Spraja article, you still have a couple of weeks in which you can do that because we won't discuss that until the 24th. We have the Why Categorical Grants article by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. I don't believe anyone signed up for that one, so I will lead a brief discussion on that article. Then we have the Bernori Financing Local Government article. That one belongs to Michelle. And then the final article for tonight is the 10th Commandments article by Nivola. Again, according to my records, no one signed up for that one. And so I'll go ahead and lead the discussion on the 10th Commandments article. So 5 articles for this evening covering the fiscal aspects of intergovernmental relations. And again, I think we'll probably be able to get through those 5 articles and finish up a little bit early this evening. So before we get into our articles for tonight, are there any additional questions or anything at all before we get started? Okay. All right, seeing none, let me double check and make
Professor,
sure. Yeah, go ahead.
quick question just to confirm. So the article critique, is there a page, like a sweet spot for the number of pages?
Not really. A lot of it depends upon the article that you're critiquing. Some of the articles are pretty descriptive, like the break article tonight. That's a very descriptive article, and so there's not a ton of analysis there. So critiques of that article tend to be a little bit shorter. Usually if you're looking for a sweet spot, 5 pages or so usually tends to be the sweet spot for a lot of these critiques. But again, it depends on the article that you are critiquing. About 5 pages, I think, is good. Okay.
Got it. Thanks.
All righty. Let's see. I have enabled screen sharing, so anyone who's leading a discussion tonight, if you have something to share, you should be able to do that. But again, that is not required. As you've seen in previous weeks, it's not a presentation. It's very much a discussion leader assignment. And so what you're trying to do, as our previous discussion leaders have done, is you're trying to engage your classmates in a discussion. So without further ado, we will start off with the Economics of Intergovernmental Grants by George Brake, and that one belongs to Taylor.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go over the economics of intergovernmental grants. And like the professor said, it was very descriptive. So hoping that you guys all read it. But if you hadn't, I'm going to go over it really quickly, just give you a brief overview of kind of what they talked about, and then we'll get into the questions. So Reggie, I think you're unmuted. There you go. Okay, so break outlines 4 different types of grants. And so I will go over those. The first being an open-ended categorical grant. This type of grant is similar to that of the, or is like the California Medicaid program, Medi-Cal. It's an important health insurance coverage to millions of Californians. This type of grant shares the characteristics of the grantee matching the requirements with an unlimited grantor funds. Funds are used by the recipient in a specific category. I think that's a key thing. And then funds are allocated based on a formula. So think of this grant as like a, obviously we look at it as an open-ended grant, but it is a specific percentage that the federal government would then allocate for the California medical program, so Medi-Cal, but there's no cap. So it's open-ended, right? So there is a specific percentage, but there's no cap. And that's the type of grant that an open-ended grant would, or open-ended categorical grant would be. So the second type of grant that he goes over is the unconditional general grant. So these unconditional general grants are completely unrestricted. So these unrestricted grants, he says, the author states that there's no examples that are completely unrestricted in federal grants. So these funds, like the name says, it's unrestricted. So the funds are without restrictions. Funds are allocated with unrestricted formulas and without participation of the grantor beyond the provision of the grant. So basically, it's a no strings attached. Here's the money, do with it what you please. We see a lot of these grants at the local and state levels, primarily just with giving money to nonprofit groups. And basically, they're like a donation. That's the best way to kind of explain it. Now, the grant that I'm most familiar with, and that I would assume a lot of you guys in this program are, is the fixed amount grants. So these type of grants would be considered like a federal categorical matching closed-ended grant. Now that's kind of a mouthful. The federal block grants and grants for education and highways. So these are normally a fixed amount and they're granted with a lot of restrictions on how you can use the money. And they normally do align with national goals. You can think of a grant like this being the education grant. So education is a categorical grant, and they're nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about education, yet there is a U.S. Department of Education. So I found that interesting. And this department does influence state governments by providing them with money, with guidelines on how to use their money, right? So you can think of that as an example of a categorical grant. So the fourth type of grant that he outlines is a project grant. So as the name says, these are grants given for a specific project. So the grantee is required to compete, for available funds by submitting detailed plans. So basically the biggest thing is they're competing. They're putting in applications to try and get money from the federal government for these specific projects. And the monies is only to be used for specific projects. So with that brief overview, I know that was kind of a lot, but I just wanted to know from the class, and I guess you can raise your hand or whatnot through Zoom, is who has experience with working with grants in their current or previous jobs? Does anybody in the class have experience with that? EFOF? So only EFOF has worked with grants in their current job? Brian? Okay. Belen, there we go. Nancy. Yay. So, I mean, exposure, I guess, too. You know, you can have exposure to these grants. You don't have to necessarily be in finance working on it in your organization. So that's great. So yeah, I see a lot of us do have some experience. I do have experience working with grants. I'm currently working in a finance division of the Long Beach Police Department. So I have exposure to Homeland Security grants. So for those who rose their hand or said yes in the chat, what, if you don't mind sharing, what kind of grants, or could you, excuse me, sorry, for those who have experience with grant funding, could you share what the grant was and the characteristics of the grant with the class?
Hi, Taylor. I'll be happy to share. When I worked with the LA Department of Public, we received the state federal grant for childhood-led poisoning prevention, and the grant was strictly tied to provide services directly. You know, if you're spending on marketing or printing or any direct any services in towards prevention, that's how the money could be spent. But you couldn't use the money directly for testing, blood-led testing, which is the whole push of it. So it's very interesting how grants worked, how you cannot really you know, use this for what you needed, but you can indirectly to support it. So I thought that was interesting, and there's a lot of caveats to it, what you can and can't use, the spending limits. Use it, you lose it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And what, you know, for the class, like based off of the 4 examples that I provided, either open-ended grant, an unrestricted grant, fixed amount grant, or a project grant, what might you think that Brian's grant would fall under that he just described?
I would say a project grant.
Okay. Possibly. I think also it could possibly considered maybe a fixed amount grant, where it had specific amounts as well, and it had a lot of oversight, right? So you had specific areas where you could spend the money, and there was a lot of kind of auditing going on, right? Making sure that you're spending it the right way.
Yeah, that's true.
Taylor, I was going to
I
share
mean,
that. Sorry, go ahead.
ladies first, go for it. Oh, okay. I don't have a lot of experience with grants personally, but I just started working for LA County, and they just received like a $35+ million grant for like a housing initiative to build like 50+ units for the elderly or youth, specifically combat homelessness. So I think that's a project grant, but I could be wrong.
Taylor, I was going to add to that I am familiar with specifically the California Office of Emergency Services Human Trafficking Victim Assistance. That's a whole mouthful, but they provide grants to organizations that are fixed. They have, like you mentioned, fixed amounts that you give. There's a whole ton of oversight. They document every single interaction and then what you do for each individual person every single time. So there's a lot of detailed work and oversight that's involved with these types of government grants. So it's from California, but then it trickles down to the state, to the local level for nonprofits that are providing these services.
And Taylor, I would also ask in these the categories that you laid out, can these grants also overlap? Can they be more than one, or it's always one or the other in terms of the category?
I think that's a great question. In the article, you can really it lays out a really good description of kind of how they do overlap, which is why in a fixed amount grant, you can see that there's kind of a lot of layers. You have your closed-ended grants, you have your federal block grants, you have your education grants and your highway grants. So they do overlap, but I would say that they do generally fall under specific categories outlined by BREEC. So I would say they tend to fall into one of these four categories. However, I could see the possibility of them kind of having very similar characteristics where it's hard to determine which type of grant it would fall under. And back to Asael, thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to share maybe their experience working with a grant in their organization?
Oh, sorry, Taylor. I myself don't work directly with grants, but OCTA, a huge one for us is Measure M. And there's different projects associated with the grant. One of the areas that I looked at that was actually part of the Measure M transportation side of it was the Senior Mobility Program. And that grant is actually open to any city who applies within Orange County and some not-for-profit organizations in which OCTA matches, if not more than matches, monies that they invest in developing within the city or the organization itself and their kind of like footprint, senior transportation. And the criteria are pretty loose, which is great, but then there are some specifics, such as the percentage that will be allotted given the percentage that the city's willing to also contribute. There's some aspects of the types of transportation you offer has to be justifiable to the kind of clientele within your city or your organization, the not-for-profit. But it ultimately stems from a major community-based transit grant that's associated with M2. But it's very project specific.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Reggie. Working in for the police department, we deal a lot with Measure A. And so I do have some experience with that, but yeah, thank you for sharing. Yesenia, did you want to share? See your hand up?
Yeah, so we work, I don't monitor or administer the grant, but I do work on the HR side for our recreation. We have a youth and veterans training grant program where we specifically for youth and veterans, it's a 15-week program. So it's very tedious because we have to make sure we get a certain amount of employees on board, train, and then they kind of go to specific divisions. And then we have to make sure that they are certified in, say, food handling by the end of the 15 weeks. So it's a lot of work to kind of make sure we follow each of the required tasks and rules that they implement. So I'm thinking this grant is probably more specific projects than maybe fixed amount grant.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that does sound like more of a fixed amount type of grant. Nancy?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Yesenia's comment. In my previous role, I worked under a grant and we had like a special timesheet that we had to fill out. And like she mentioned, like it was very tedious. Like if we did it wrong, then we would have to start all over from scratch. And so in my presentation, I'll get into some of the caveats of these grants too, but it just like it took me back to that job that I had and how it was very specific and I could only do certain things and I had to report whether or not those things got completed or not, and if they didn't, why.
Yes, and I'm glad that you just said that because I on some of the grants that I've worked with, I've worked with like I said, some federal grants, one of them being the UWASI grant. which is the Urban Area Security Initiatives Grant. So, and along with the Port Security Grant, which is what we call PSGP as an abbreviation. So with the Urban Area Security Grant, it's a Homeland Security grant. And basically they tell us that we can only spend money on things that enhance regional preparedness and capabilities in high threat and high density areas. So for the city of Long Beach, there's a it's a dense population. We're right next to the port. And so this grant, we do fall under the characteristics of being able to receive it. But the specific guidelines are for purchases, and these, and it's been helpful for us because actually we did purchase our helicopters and SWAT vehicles with these monies. So that grant, specifically from my experience, has been very helpful, for our department. And then in addition to that, another federal grant that we've worked with has been the PSGP, or the Port Security Grant. So as previously mentioned, Long Beach is right there next to the port, and we have that area, and we need to make sure it's safe, right? And so this grant, like Nancy pointed out, it pays for the salary of our port officers. So basically, I guess in theory, you can say, if it wasn't for this grant, we would not have that division in our department. And so that grant not only did the salaries of takes care of the salaries of our employees, it also has helped us procure boats and the different maintenance of those water craft. Okay. So is there anyone else that wants to share about their grant, or I can continue to move forward? Okay, so as you can tell, a lot of these grants, at least the ones that we've all worked with, have a lot of restrictions and stipulations on how money can be spent. Now, one question I thought of was that knowing that these intergovernmental grants are funded by tax dollars, do you feel that the government issued grants should identify as more of an unrestricted and up to local municipalities on spending? Or is it better, in your opinion, for grants to have these restrictions and special allocations? So basically, in short term, do you think that they should be more unrestricted, like federal grants should be more unrestricted, where the local government should just be given the money and say, use it as you please? Or do you feel like it should have these restrictions? What are you guys' thoughts about that?
I actually feel that there should be restrictions. I think that having this is the money, use it as you please. It's great when the grant is in a restricted format, is given to a program that doesn't really need that much funding. Because then you can just allocate from that, you can transfer, but you can do transfers. There's ways of doing transfers regardless. But I think having it more specific is a better control over the checks and balance, and make sure that the monies are used appropriately, allocated appropriately, invested appropriately, whatever the situation is. And that you see a result that you have more ability, in my opinion, to stay connected, to see the final result as dictated by the grant and what the money should be used for.
Yes, thank you for sharing, Reggie. I see your hand up, Nancy.
Yeah, so yeah, I tend to agree with Reggie. I think that there should be those restrictions, like Brian had mentioned, for the printing materials. So if you're getting a grant just for printing materials, everyone's aware we can only use it for this particular reason. Whereas if there are no restrictions, I can see people kind of getting greedy and saying like, well, no, we should do it for this. Well, no, we should do that. And it might create more issues. And whatever the intent of that grant was, it may not be used for that intent. Whereas, if you have a specific pot of money and you can only use it for a certain task or a certain project or for salaries, then you know exactly what that money is going towards.
Yeah, and just to echo what Nancy and my classmates have mentioned, I think that by having these restrictions, you're holding governments accountable for a project. We all know how busy we can get it, and then you just don't want any project to fall through the cracks. And so I think part of the restrictions that come with these grants are sort of timelines for completions that you have to submit prior or during the application process. And so I think if those weren't there, then a grant to help build a bike lane in a city would take forever. But by having these estimated completion dates and additional restrictions, you help keep the process moving.
Yes, and I actually do agree with what all of you guys are saying, is that I do think that restrictions are definitely necessary, especially because people get greedy with money and they want to do whatever they want to do, and with no restrictions they just it might not be the best thing, right? So now, though having restrictions is kind of the consensus, what I'm seeing that the class feels is necessary. Do you think that maybe having these restrictions might push organizations away from not wanting the grant funding? Anybody?
Taylor, I'm part of an organization that provides grants, albeit to nonprofits, not to intergovernmental agencies. And there's a big push within foundations and grant making to really have a trust-based philanthropy approach, which means you don't just give money and it's willy-nilly, they can do whatever they want. There's definitely some parameters around that, but you do offer opportunities to fund general operating costs, which a lot of grants, unfortunately, have so many restrictions that don't allow to fund general operating costs, like just keeping the lights on, paying your administrative staff, paying for buildings, things that are not necessarily program related. And so there is at least a movement within private philanthropy to be more open to fund these opportunities while still putting the guardrails in place for nonprofits to be able to report back how the funds are being used. Yes, here's a general operating cost grant, but please report back on how you're doing it, and then creating this relationship that's really trust-based to see how it continues to evolve. Now, obviously, if an organization outright just takes the funding and, I don't know, does some really weird, hanky things with it, then that makes you reassess how you continue that relationship moving forward with that organization. But as a funder, having to put so many parameters around funding to nonprofits sometimes stifle their opportunity and their ability to grow and be able to provide even better services that aren't prescribed by an entity like an intergovernmental agency.
Yes, thank you for sharing, Asael. Now back to just kind of to sum everything up, because we are talking about intergovernmental relations, right? And how these all kind of tie together. When reading this, I do have experience working with grants, and I was able to take a deeper dive into how, these all connect, right? And how the federal government, has influence over the state governments, then who has influence over the local governments, and how almost like they're putting their like what their political agendas are for moving forward with their goals, and giving that to the states and saying, look, this is what we want, this is what you're going to do with our money, or you're not going to get it. And so that's kind of where I was getting at as to like restrictions and how money should be allocated when it comes to grants. So I do want to kind of sum it up with that, and I thank you all for participating, and I will turn it back to you, Dr. Powell.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Very well done. And I agree with you. The primary utility of the break article is this typology they provide for us of different types of grants, as you so eloquently said. And I do think when we are looking at these different types of grants, we have to consider the motivations of the grantor. And so we saw in the 1960s when the national government, the Johnson administration, was trying to get state and local governments to accomplish the goals of the war on poverty and the Great Society. The Johnson administration did not have a whole lot of trust in state and local governments to accomplish those goals. And that's why we saw a lot of these restrictions in the form of these categorical types of grants. Then when we saw the Nixon administration come into office, the Nixon administration had a lot more trust in state and local governments, not only in terms of what they're doing, but also more trust in them in terms of setting their own goals and setting their own objectives. And so that's why we saw the Nixon administration start to rely more upon these unconditional grants, things such as general revenue sharing. Then in the 1980s in the Reagan administration, as we had talked about previously, Reagan shared Nixon's approach to state and local governments. Reagan believed in decentralization, devolution, and deregulation and trusted state and local governments. And so therefore, the Reagan administration really started to rely much more upon block grants and remove a lot of those restrictions from those block grants. And so really it depends upon what the donor, what the grantor is trying to accomplish and how much the grantor trusts the recipients of those grants. The difference between project and formula grants is also an interesting type of discussion as well. With project grants, you could use project grants if you want to kind of gauge a potential recipient's interest in this grant. Because what you'll do with project grants is the recipients will then put together proposals. So as the grantor, you put out requests for proposals. Then the potential recipients will then construct their proposals, and their proposals will then go to the national government, and then the national government will then choose recipients based upon the merit of those proposals. That's kind of a more project type of approach as opposed to a formulaic approach. Formulaic approaches we see oftentimes in terms of education grants. At the state level, these foundation formulas that are used to determine how much grant money, how much basic aid local governments, local school districts should get from the state. You put in the characteristics of that local school district into that formula, and those districts that fare better based upon the calculation, the formula, are the ones that will get more state aid as compared to other districts. And so, again, it's kind of interesting to see with a formulaic grant, essentially almost everyone's going to get money from the state, but the amount of money you get is going to depend upon the characteristics of your district. And so the percentage of at-risk students, at-risk pupils, what we call the unduplicated pupil population, the higher your unduplicated pupil population, the more money you'll get as a result of this formula. But the break article is a great way to start because it does present us with this typology of here are these different types of grants. And as we go through the remainder of our articles tonight, we're going to kind of return to this discussion of categorical grants versus block grants. And so break creates a really nice frame of reference for our future articles. But again, excellent job. Thank you very much, Taylor. Appreciate it. And now we will build upon that and move to our next article, the Federal Grants and Aid to State Governments Political Analysis by our good friend Philip Moneypenny. And Moneypenny article then belongs to Nancy. So Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. So I am going to share my screen. And Taylor hit a lot of great points. And like Dr. Powell mentioned, she really set up the floor to talk more about grants. So my article was Federal Grants and Aid. And the article goes into what federal grants and aid are. And it's federal money that is given to fund a project or a program. And this type of aid, according to Moneypenny, is a classic extension of financial assistance from one government to another. And the reason why this is so important is because this is an additional support for some governments, but not all. So it really depends on how well a government is able to support itself. Moneypenny also discusses major federal grants, and these include Medicaid programs, which is the largest financial grants and aid that's given to states. And he goes on to say that the states, these grants aren't to equalize the programs or level the playing field, but rather to provide additional support. And an important thing to note is that we need to be cognizant of where this money is coming from. So a lot of federal programs need to get their money from some place. And so as we begin to talk about grants, I would just want you to keep that in the back of your mind that although this money is important, we also need to realize that it has to come out of other places. And so another thing that we need to consider when thinking about federal aid is that it adds another layer of administrative oversight. So again, like we discussed with Taylor, there's more to just receiving the money. So we take the money, but we have to give something in return as well. And so according to Moneypenny, this dilutes the responsibility and slows and increases a need of documentation. So the article does make it clear that grant and aid is not to undermine federalism, but rather it's a way to improve it. So my first question for the class is, and you'll see that I have some of my questions kind of similar to what Taylor had for you. Have you been a part of an organization that has received grant funding? And do you believe it benefited or hindered the organization?
I can start. So the grant that I helped my city with was related to an update to the hazard mitigation plan, which the city has to do anyway. And normally we pay for this out of general funds, but because we got the grants, we were able to save, I think it ended up being $60,000. And this was through Cal OES and FEMA. And so they actually also, we had to increase our grant because through the bidding process, we ended up going with a contractor that provided better services, and obviously that cost more money. And they were flexible with that. So I think the organization overall benefited because it's a task that we have to complete. The difference being that we got money for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely a big benefit.
Hello, Nancy.
Yes.
Yeah, so for I work for City of Stanton, and for the Parks and Rec Department, we're able to receive a grant through Proposition 68. So with this, it was more geared towards like acquisition of open spaces, increasing diversity and inclusion in the communities. So we've got around almost 8 million. And with this, we're still in the process of everything, but we awarded a vendor ready to create the park. The park is pre-existing. It is shared with the Garden Grove School District. So right now there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes to get everything formalized before groundbreaking. But it is pretty interesting to see everything. The everything that comes with sharing a space with the school district. But I believe it has benefited us because without this money, that space probably just would have been nothing for generations to come. And now it's going to create a whole new park for the community.
Yeah, again, a big benefit. And I think most grants, it is for the benefit of an organization or a program or project. I know working under a grant, my job duties got changed very drastically when I went from working with a particular school and then working under a grant. So I don't know that it hindered, but it was definitely a learning curve for me. Does anyone else have anything to add?
I can add something. So we currently got this new grant. It's called the CASE program. It's the Cannabis Awareness Program. So I think that's actually helping our city because we were able to hire more code enforcement officers and more community service officers to kind of go out to the community and bring awareness to cannabis. Because we do have a couple of cannabis locations in the city, which was a big issue for, I think last year, it ended up being like a very chaotic council meeting. So with this grant, we're kind of educating the public and they're kind of coming around to accepting having that into the city. So that definitely benefited my organization.
That's awesome, Yesenia. All right, well, I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. So to what extent do you believe local government accounts for federal grants when creating their budgets? And one of the things that Moneypenny discusses in his article is that these federal grants and aid program or grants, they're applicable to a lot of areas, but mostly when it comes to education, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to agriculture. So do you believe that when it comes to something like education, is there a belief that, oh, well, they'll receive grants or they'll receive some additional funding, so it's okay to not give them more money?
So one example that I can think of is regarding an organization that has an office in the city of Whittier. It's called First Day, and they help individuals experiencing homelessness or sort of in transition. And the city recently had a debate of whether or not to continue their funding because they receive a large sum from the county and they don't just service Whittier residents. And so I think because the city knows how much funding First Day is getting from the county, they're more reluctant to give them city dollars.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of how when creating a budget, they may feel that, well, there might be external money coming in, so we don't have to account for, a larger budget for that particular program or issue. Does anybody else have anything else to add?
I can share kind of previously what I've shared about our port grant, specifically when it comes to the budget. So when the police department has the biggest budget in the city of Long Beach, and I know that when creating their budget, it definitely helps us because we do know that we are getting funding for that port division and their salaries. So we do take that into account, and we do when creating budgets and for the police department. And I think it does help us a lot, and we don't have to create that budget and extra spending for that specific division.
Yeah, I think you mentioned that you were able to get a helicopter.
Yeah, that was with one of our other grants. But yeah, it has helped purchase a lot of different equipment for the city. And like our SWAT vehicles and our helicopter that you would see all the time. But so without the grant, we wouldn't have been able to get those, or we would have, but we would have had to use general fund, and it would have been a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Speaking purely on the education side, that's been my only work experience, just higher ed. And I think that, just working in public institutions, the funding isn't that great because they are able to get different types of grants. And like I mentioned earlier, I used to work for a community college, and they would get tons of grants for different things. And so I do believe that maybe when the governor is making the budget, he thinks about these things beforehand and says, well, they're really good about securing grants, and maybe we shouldn't adjust their budget too much. But does anyone else have anything they'd like to add before we move on to the next question? All right, I'll move on to the next one. So for this question, for the class, have you experienced any restrictions in any of your current or previous roles due to a grant? If so, what were those restrictions and how did they affect your role in the organization?
I have an example. I think someone mentioned it earlier that when you're working under a grant, jobs are very specific. And when I first got to my organization, I had no idea that a certain employee was working under a grant because he had the same title. It looked like he was just a regular city employee. And when we were discussing duties and, we had to work on the city website, he said that, he can't do it because it falls out of his purview and his grant, and he needs to focus on a different or his responsibilities that are clearly outlined. So I thought that was really interesting and very specific. So I think you have to really like what you do because you have no room for any like creative outline outside of what your scope is in your grant work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I had a role where I worked for a school and then they presented an opportunity and I didn't realize that it meant working under a grant. And so my job duties shifted drastically after that. So I understand both sides. Does anyone else have experience, or maybe you've seen it, like Michelle discussed, where someone's working under a grant and some restrictions were put under their work?
Yeah, I can share an example. So working under this, excuse me, same grant for the hazard mitigation plan, our initially we wanted to do a sole source process where you choose someone that maybe you've worked with based on previous qualifications. But one of the requirements or restrictions of the grant was that it had to go out to a bidding process. And so that affected the timeline of the project because the bidding process takes a couple of months. And that's if you do receive qualified bids that then you have to review and then everything has to go to council. And so because we had the restriction of going to bid, it delayed the process by, I think, 6 months.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so these federal and aid grants, they're really helpful, but they do put a lot more restrictions. And like Penny said, it dilutes responsibility and it slows down, some of these processes. So while they're very helpful, they also, create some barriers to get to that end goal. And lastly, do you believe federal grants and aid are necessary, or should local government try to account for additional funding for public education, agriculture, and mental hospitals? In other words, should we rely on grants, or should local government try to find funding and then, federal grants and aid can just be a bonus on top of that?
And I can kind of chime in on this one. I think that, at least from my experience working with federal grants, that it is necessary, especially for the work that my department does. It doesn't obviously have to do with education, agriculture, or mental hospitals, but I think that it is necessary and that it's beneficial to have that help from the federal government, especially for to help in their goal, in a national security realm of.
I'd like to echo Taylor's words. I think that it is necessary, and local municipalities already have like a lot to handle, especially in the way of infrastructure and public safety. That asking them to take on all of these other extras is it just not it's not feasible.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jason.
I can share from the mental hospital perspective. I work at a state hospital, and I can see how, the kind of like the building and just the grounds of where we work. If it weren't for the federal grants, I don't know, I would not know what state the buildings would be in, because they're already struggling, just to keep them maintained the way they are, because they're old buildings, and without the funding, these hospitals wouldn't be able to sustain themselves with, through the state or through local municipalities. But that said, though, I think it's important that the grants, they have to be justified, and they have to be there has to be some accountability, because if there isn't, the funds are being used in areas where, they're not important. So I firmly believe that the justification for the funds is needed.
Yeah, I agree with you, Michael. While there are priorities and local governments have their hands full, these federal grants and aid are really necessary, but there should still be that level of accountability.
The only problem is when we have like a budget deficit, like in the state of California. That's the only time those grants are in question.
Mhm. All right. Well, if no one else has anything else to add, I'd like to thank everyone who participated and all of those that were just listening in. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Well done. And one of the things I really do appreciate, and this is a thank you to everyone who's participated, is with these articles, a lot of the arguments made in the articles are very much, kind of theoretical in nature. And I think there's some good arguments made in the articles. What really makes the articles come to life are the examples that everyone's providing. I think that's exactly what we need to do in this class, is to update a lot of these articles with examples of how you see this actually happen in your organization. So I want to commend everyone for being able to do that, both here in Nancy's discussion as well as in Taylor's discussion. I think that really adds a lot to our understanding of the articles. And I think that Nancy, I like all of your questions. I really like the one question about, do local governments take into account the potential for federal grants when they put together their budgets? I think that's a really important question, because it really underscores some of the lack of, I don't know if I want to say faith, but the lack of trust that this federal money is going to continue to come in. And I think that's true as well at the state level. When local governments put their budgets together, will they be, like Jason said, will they be able to still get this grant money, even when you've got a $39 billion budget deficit, or whatever the case may be at the state level? There is a theory in the budgeting literature that's called the flypaper effect, and it's by a person by the name of James Fawcett. And I'll put his name in text chat. But James Fawcett came up with this idea of the flypaper effect. And the flypaper effect essentially says that federal money tends to stick where it hits, because the recipient of those federal grants, whether it be a state government or a local government, usually they do not trust that that money is going to continue to come in the future. And so therefore, they're going to take that money and they're going to use it in a prescribed area. But you're typically not going to see a state or local government reduce their tax rates or do some type of reallocation of money between funds just because they're getting federal money, because they really can't trust that that federal money is going to continue. And so it's a flypaper effect, is that federal money tends to stick wherever it hits. The Moneypenny article, I like the article a lot. I think, Nancy, you did a nice job of really, and you focused on the primary argument of Moneypenny, which, as you said, is page 185 there, that last paragraph, where he says the grant and aid system is by no means an undermining of federalism, but rather a refinement of it. And as Nancy said, that's kind of his main argument, is that this grant system, it's not a perversion of federalism, but we have this federal grant and aid system because of our system of federalism. And he arrives at that conclusion by using a philosophical approach known as the straw man argument. If you're familiar with the straw man argument, what you do is you set up these straw men, you set up these arguments for the purpose of then knocking them down. So you set up an argument. This is why we have the federal grant and aid system, knowing that you're then going to provide evidence to dispute that theory. And then you put up another theory, and then you dispute that theory, all for the purpose of adding credence and adding evidence to the theory that you actually believe, which is federal grants and aid are really a part and an artifact of our federal system. And some of the arguments that he sets up, some of the straw men he sets up and then knocks down, are things such as, well, maybe the federal government uses grants and aid in order to try and equalize between state and local governments. So the federal government realizes that not every state and local government has equal revenue raising ability. And so therefore, they're going to use these federal grants and aid to try and equalize revenue across all these different governments. Well, that sounds really nice, but then Moneypenny says it's not really true, because most of these federal grant programs don't have equalization components to them. If they are really trying to equalize, they would have equalization components, and they simply, most of them do not have that. Says, well, maybe a second reason we have the federal grant and aid program is because these federal grants and aid are meant to try and push a national objective, a national goal or objective. Well, okay, yeah, we have seen that in the past with, as we mentioned with our last article, the Great Society and the war on poverty. So sometimes we have seen that, but there is an intersection between what are national and what are state objectives. And oftentimes, what is a national objective is oftentimes also a state objective. So if your objective is to try and lower unemployment rates, well, that's probably the objective of a state government as well. If your national objective is cleaner water, that's going to probably be the objective of the state government as well. So it's really hard to kind of parcel out what is a national goal versus what is a state goal. So he then sets up another straw man argument. Well, maybe these federal grant and aid programs are really meant to try and stimulate state and local spending. Well, there's a problem with that as well, because oftentimes state and local governments are, as we know, the laboratories of democracy. And so the state and local governments oftentimes pioneer these new approaches to try and solve these policy problems long before the national government. So it's really the state and local governments that are the pioneers. It's not the national government stimulating them to come up with these new ideas. So he kind of knocks that argument down as well. So, well, maybe it's to help out these state and local governments because they have so much difficulty raising money. Well, that's not really true either, because state and local governments in this country are relatively self-sufficient. As you'll see when we go over the Nivola article, most state and local governments on average will raise about 2/3 of their own money. 2/3 of their revenue comes from own source revenue, which is very unusual in comparison to subnational governments around the world. In Britain, the local governments raise less than a fifth of their money, and all the rest of it comes from the national government. And Nivola will give us a lot of examples of other countries where subnational governments actually rely more on the federal government. So our state and local governments, for the most part here in the US, don't really have that much trouble raising money. They rely very heavily upon their own source revenue. Well, let's try another argument, says Moneypenny. And this other argument is, well, federal grants and aid are expenditures without responsibility. And he essentially says that's not true either. There's kind of a grain of truth there, but it's not completely true because tax money is tax money. And whenever you have to raise taxes, whether you're raising taxes at the national level or at the state level or at the local level, a tax increase is a tax increase is a tax increase. So by knocking all of these different theories down, he arrives at the theory that Nancy told us correctly is that, well, this is kind of the federal grant and aid program is kind of tailor made for our system of federalism. And not only is our system of federalism the creator of this federal grants and aid program, but our system of federalism creates a certain type of grant known as the categorical grant. And as Taylor introduced us to in the break article, you compare this categorical to a block grant. Categorical grants are the specific grants of money for specific types of expenditures with a lot of restrictions and a lot of accountability requirements. So why then, in our federal grant and aid system, do we tend to gravitate toward these specific categorical grants? And he gives us a lot of political arguments for why we have these categorical grants. One, he says, we don't have the strength of specificity of aim in terms of getting legislation through Congress. You don't have to have that strong of a coalition to get a grant program through Congress, but in order to get a mandate or a piece of legislation, a policy or a law through Congress, you need to have a much more unified, a much more tighter coalition. Most of our coalitions tend to be very loose, they tend to be very transient, and so a categorical grant really fits the purposes of these loose coalitions a little bit better. He also makes the argument that categorical grants allow Congress to use their fiscal power instead of using their policy power. And it's easier for them to use their fiscal power and to create a grant program than it is to create a policy. With policies, as we know, you have winners and you have losers. There, and you probably know this from the policy class, but there are different categories of public policies we have in this country. But the most common public policy is a redistributive policy, where the policy will redistribute wealth from one segment of society to another. Whenever you redistribute wealth across your society, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. So a redistributive policy is going to create a lot of enemies. Compare that to a grant. A grant, everyone or the vast majority of governments get some grant proceeds. So everyone kind of wins with this grant program. So grants are much easier to get through Congress than redistributive policies or redistributive programs. And so that all comes back then to his final conclusion that Nancy told us is that our grant and aid system is really much more of a refinement of federalism as opposed to being some perversion of our federalist system. And so our federalist system is the reason why we end up having these federal grants and aid, and specifically the reason why we end up having these specific types of categorical grants. But speaking of those specific types of categorical grants, the next article, the Why Categorical Grants article by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, picks up on this money penny argument and then provides us with some similar reasons as to why we tend toward the use of these very specific and somewhat restrictive categorical grants. And in the ACIR article, they provide for us three basic reasons why we have categorical grants. The first reason, they say, economic and fiscal considerations. The second one, the constitutional and philosophical traditions of the United States. And the third one, the features of the decision-making process in the American political system. So the ACIR starts with this idea of economic and fiscal reasons for categorical grants. One of the reasons the authors offer up for why we have categorical grants is to deal with this issue of spillovers. So you're all familiar with spillovers, but somebody tell me, what is a spillover? What do they mean by a spillover? And you think of sometimes we refer to these spillovers as being externalities. So if we're going to do something there could be some unintended consequences, some spillover effects, some externalities onto other segments of society that we did not really mean to affect. And so these externalities, these spillovers can be negative externalities, they can be positive externalities. A negative externality, a negative spillover is a negative unintended consequence, like pollution. So the widget factory wants to make the best widget possible, but in the process of making this widget, the widget factory pollutes the river that runs behind the widget factory. That is a negative spillover, that's a negative externality. That suggests a role for government. That government gets involved with negative externalities to try and limit the production of those negative externalities. But then you can also have positive spillovers, positive consequences. And so an example could be a childhood immunization program. So you have a childhood immunization program that provides these immunizations to families under a certain income threshold. And so the primary beneficiary of this immunization program will be those children and those families who are receiving those immunizations. But the positive spillover could be that everyone in the community will have a lower risk of infection because of this immunization program. All these other folks in our jurisdiction, they are not specifically participating in the program, but they are getting a positive benefit. They're kind of free riders getting this positive spillover, this positive externality. So the first argument the ACR makes is maybe we have categorical grants to try and address these spillovers, these unintended consequences, these externalities. And again, I think there is a grain of truth to that, but the ACR points out that that's not solely sufficient to explain why we have categorical grants. So it contributes to it, but it's not solely sufficient. So they then turn their attention to political factors. They say, well, let's look at the politics of the American political system. In this argument, they actually straight up reference Philip Moneypenny. And they reference Moneypenny's argument about how federal grants and aid are really a refinement of our political system. And they make the argument that we have a lot of these influences from interest groups. And last week we talked, well, not last week, but our last class session, we talked about interest groups. We talked about why interest groups form, and we talked about public interest groups and how governments influence Congress through the use of these public interest groups. So we know we do have a lot of interest group influence that will help shape the policies that come out of Congress and will also help shape the types of grants that come out of Congress as well. With traditional interest groups oftentimes will have a very narrow policy focus. So a very narrow specific categorical grant will probably fit that narrow policy focus a little bit better than a more general block grant or general revenue sharing or some type of unrestricted grant like Brake tells us about. So categorical grants kind of fit this idea of the influence from these very specific individual interest groups. Then they also talk about this idea of federal distrust in state and local governments. And this gets back to something we talked about a little bit earlier on with Taylor's article, and that is when the grantor, in this case, the national government, does not trust state and local governments, they're probably going to use a much more specific grant with a lot more restrictions, a lot more accountability requirements. In other words, they're going to use a categorical grant. I think rather than just accepting this idea that the national government distrusts state and local governments, I think we kind of have to delve a little bit deeper into that and ask the question, why do you think the national government has distrust in state and local governments? So that's my question for you. Why do you think that there is this federal distrust in state and local government?
Lack of transparency.
Sure. Yeah. Lack of transparency. The programs and policies are being implemented at the state and the local level. And so all the details of how these policies and programs are being implemented, those are found at the subnational level. And so sometimes state and local governments are not that forthcoming with the national government in terms of how this money is being spent, how these programs are being implemented. So I would agree. When there's a lack of transparency, that oftentimes does. Well, it does lead to distrust on the part of the national government. So absolutely. Why else is there federal distrust?
Well, the climate is super political. So if you don't agree with whatever politics are leading it, you're automatically going to assume something completely different of the people governing.
Right. Absolutely. And one of the themes of later on, we have two articles, the State of American Federalism articles from the past 2 years, and we'll cover those in a future class session. But that's one of the primary themes from those articles is that the current tenor of the relationship between national, state, and local governments is one of distrust, and that distrust often comes from a political place. If you have a conservatively controlled House of Representatives, they're probably going to have a lot of distrust in democratically run cities. And so they're not going to have a lot of trust in San Francisco and in Los Angeles and these large cities that have democratic administrations. This whole argument about sanctuary cities and the House of Representatives going to crack down on sanctuary cities and take federal money away from sanctuary cities, I think that is very much emblematic of this distrust that we see because of political differences between the majority in the House versus the majority that controls a large city. So I think that certainly does contribute a lot to that federal distrust. For years and really for decades, there has been federal distrust in state governments dating back into the 1800s. A lot of distrust between Congress and southern states in the lead up to the Civil War. A lot of distrust between Congress and southern states in the 1950s and the 1960s with the Jim Crow laws and the use of poll taxes and literacy tests for the purpose of the disenfranchisement of certain categories and groups of voters based upon race in southern states. So I think there is a lot of history of distrust between national and state and local governments. The more federal distrust there is, the more regulations and stipulations the federal government will build into these very specific types of categorical grants. I think another compelling reason that the ACR offers up is Congress and the way in which Congress operates. As Woodrow Wilson told us, Congress at work is Congress in committees. We know that Congress is very much organized around this idea of division of labor. And so we have congressional committees, we have congressional subcommittees, and those committees and those subcommittees divide up the work and divide up the legislating process in Congress. And that's just the way in which Congress operates. When you have that type of division of labor and you have so much power being given over to these subcommittees, it would make sense that the grants that come out of that process would also then tend to be very specific types of grants as well. So a specific categorical grant could very well be caused by this legislative specialization that goes on in the House and the Senate, and oftentimes goes on in state legislatures as well. And not to get too much into the weeds on this, but there were two major amendments to the way in which Congress operated in the 1960s and the 1970s. In the House, we had what were called the Hansen Amendments, and in the Senate, we had the Stevenson Amendments. What the Hansen and Stevenson Amendments did is they created a subcommittee Bill of Rights, whereby we said each subcommittee has its own unique jurisdiction, and it is guaranteed to be able to consider legislation within its specific jurisdiction. So whenever you create these ironclad specific jurisdictions for these subcommittees, we shouldn't be surprised if that legislative specialization then results in very specialized types of grants, such as categorical grants. And categorical grants, finally, according to the ACR, really contribute to our system of social pluralism. We like to think in this country that we are a pluralistic country. We like to think that people have the ability to participate in their own governance when an issue is of importance to them. Now, I think we can certainly make some arguments about how our decision making sometimes is more elitist than pluralistic, but we'd like to think of ourselves as having a socially pluralistic type of society. The more pluralism you have, the more actors you have involved, the more difficult it is to gain agreement the more difficult it is to gain agreement, the more likely you are to have these types of grants, such as categorical grants. So I think what the utility of this ACR article is it just provides more support for the Moneypenny article that these grants and aid programs, especially these categorical grants, really are very much artifacts of our political system. They're artifacts of our history. They're artifacts of the way in which our legislatures work and of legislative specialization. So again, to underscore the Moneypenny argument, they are not perversions of our system of politics, but rather they are refinements of our system of federalism. So a lot of good reasons why we do tend to see the use of these categorical grants. But as I started out our discussion tonight, talking about whenever the national government distrusts state and local governments, whenever the national government doesn't believe that state and local governments will, on their own volition, try and achieve national objectives, it's at that point where they need to craft these very specific categorical grants with a lot of reporting requirements and a lot of accountability mechanisms. Okay, I see. I'll wrap that up now in terms of the discussion of the why categorical grants article. I don't want to, beat a dead horse too much, but I think it's a really good justification for why we see the types of grants we see in our system of American federalism. I see that we are now at 7:20 or so. So let's take a break, and we'll say take a break to 7:35. If you come on back at 7:35, we will then move on to our next article, the Bernori article, Financing Local Government in a Changing World, which will be Michelle's. And then I'll wrap up the show tonight with a discussion of 10th Commandments, the DeVolo article. So take a break to 7:35 and come on back and we will finish up. Okay, it's 7:35, so welcome back again. And we will move into our next article. And our next article is the Financing Local Government in a Changing World. That's David Bernori, and that one belongs to Michelle. So is Michelle
Thank you,
here?
Dr. Powell.
There you go.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm here. Hello, everyone. So I'm just gonna dive right into it. We've been talking a lot about grants, and obviously grants and taxes kind of go hand in hand. But this article explores challenges faced by American local governments in context of the federal system. It focuses on inherent limitations on taxing authority. The article discusses impacts of historical tax revolts and anti-tax biases in political process, legal constraints, the local government's ability to impose taxes, and it goes back to the 21st century, highlighting technological advancements, international trade, and deregulation as key factors of influencing local government finance. This article highlights the competition among local governments for business investments, emphasizing the importance of offering competitive services with reasonable tax burdens due to mobility of individuals and firms. The analysis research also it posed posed challenges by traditional tax systems that suggest that without radical change, certain taxes may struggle to generate sufficient revenue. Globalization and increased international trade are prime examples of that, indicating that local governments are trying to actively participate in international economic development to attract foreign investments. This article also addressed challenges posed by technological advances, emphasizing the importance of electronic commerce and what that does to traditional revenue sources like sales tax, which is generally connected to a specific location. When it's online, it doesn't do that. And deregulation in key industries such as electricity and telecommunications to force changes in state and local business tax systems. Another huge component is the aging population, which is a key identified challenge to local governments, particularly to those living on a fixed income. As we know, taxes will increase, but those fixed incomes stay the same. So with that little background, I'm gonna jump into my first question and ask you guys, why do you think scholars and new generations coming up are concerned about traditional tax systems and supporting local governments?
What was the question?
Um, why do you think scholars are concerned about traditional tax systems supporting local governments?
Hi, Michelle, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So I think one of the things that was mentioned in the article is property taxes. And that really resonated with somebody that cannot afford a home. And so I think governments can't really rely on property taxes. Well, I guess they can rely on the people that currently own, but there's a decline in purchasing. So there might be a decrease in the number of funds that they collect from, these future generations.
Yeah, Ifa, that's a great point. And it's so true. I think times have definitely changed and funding definitely doesn't go as far as it did back in the day. Definitely a lot more homeowners, not in our generation, I feel. So I definitely resonate with that. And another example, the sales tax, for instance, it originated as a temporary revenue measure during the Great Depression, and times have changed since then. So times are evolving, but the tax isn't really, no changes are being made. Does anyone have any other perspectives?
I would probably say maybe unfair tax distribution. We always see how the 1% and a lot of the corporations really don't pay their fair share of tax. And so I think that, as far as checks and balances are concerned, there's always a disparity between those who pay what they're supposed to pay or pay more than their fair share versus those who have the means to do it and somehow slip through the loopholes.
Yes, I think that's very true too. And thank you for bringing that up. That actually leads me to my next question is that kind of goes into all the technological advances and how international trade affects, with virtual transactions, it's very easy for people to also kind of finesse the system and, evade tax purposes, making it challenging, to when it happens remotely, it's hard to determine appropriate jurisdictions for taxation. So I think there's loopholes in everything. And what challenges do you guys think that technological advances pose for local government revenue?
I think as maybe companies before when you had a business, it was very land-based, and now with the internet, I think it's not necessarily tied to a physical space. So maybe taxing, because companies don't look the same as they did in the past, it may be difficult to tax them correctly. That's just one thought I had.
Oh, and can I piggyback on what Josephina just said? So the concept of property tax is a primary for local taxation for funding or to get taxes. And when you're looking at technological advances, going with what Josephina said, is that you're no longer bound to a certain location, a physical location. So that being said, it will affect the need for land, the need for an actual physical location, and therefore a need for it'll lessen the ability to increase property tax or even collect on property tax. So all of that kind of in electronic commerce, it all ties in together. Business taxes, everything else, because it's the factor of it being so mobile. It's not locked in where you can guarantee and almost forecast the level of taxes that you'll be able to recoup to then interpret that to your budget.
Yeah, that's so true. Thank you for sharing. It's like a snowball effect that just continues to roll and kind of hits a lot of the different aspects that make it difficult. Um, and I know that some of us do work with aging in populations and um, vulnerable community members. I know that my city has an aging in place um, workshop or kind of like a collaborative to assure that seniors and they can age in place peacefully. And so how do you guys think that the aging in place population challenge local government financing?
Would this be when people own their homes and they like transfer their homes to a family member so they like avoid the new property tax increase?
Yeah, it also goes into, the concern that real estate values and property taxes increase way faster than elderly homeowners on fixed incomes. And property tax being tied to the value of the real estate, um, it some people can't even pay it, so they go into default and then they're at risk of losing their homes. And um, while it's really sad, that's also a revenue that you know, taxing is kind of relying upon, and they have no guarantee that they will get that money because, you can't pull from what you don't have.
And if I could piggyback on that, I mean, in the article itself, it says that by 2030, we're looking at a 20% increase or 20% of the population being 65 and above. And seniors tend to be opposed to any increases in property tax. Property tax tends to fund local schools. So with an increasing aging population, you're looking at the ramification that any attempt to increase property taxes they're going to be opposed to, which snowball effect is going to affect funding for school taxes.
Yeah, that's very true. Snowball effect for sure. Does anyone else have anything to add regarding that? Okay, then I'll move on to my final question. And this is kind of a creative one, thinking, how do you guys think that local governments can adapt to challenges of all these issues and relying on these taxes? And is there something that local governments can do? What can they kind of do to, you know, fill in that gap where it's definitely happening and coming?
Well, I think it's a fair assumption that nobody likes their taxes increased. But if they're going to be increased, let it be for something that the community wants, right? So to give an example, in the city of Whittier, public safety was a big thing, and fixing up the parks. And so the city ended up, through voter passage, implementing, I think it was a 0.25% increase in sales taxes. And the city online will document how much funding was received in the year and where that funding went. And so in a city that is traditionally opposed to an increase in taxes, you see people being satisfied with the results because they themselves had a say in where the money went. And then they get to see that the money's actually going there.
I think that's a really great point, Aoife. Thank you for sharing. I work for City of West Hollywood, who has the highest sales tax in, I think, all of Los Angeles, 10.25%. And people are definitely not happy about it. It's difficult to please everybody. But, the city is in great standing, and kind of it's hard to fit everything into one shoe. But we're also a very small city. So it's 1.9 square miles long. So to raise taxes on that kind of scale, it's difficult. A lot of people are really struggling, and they're not seeing as much progress as they want to see. They feel like their output is higher than the input that they're receiving. So definitely very challenging. And it's hard to, I feel like I work for the city and it's hard for me to know, where the funds are going unless you're very in tune and doing the research and really going to all the council meetings and really paying attention. It's a lot of research that you have to do to figure out where all those funds are going. So I don't think they make it easy either, just for a regular person who has no experience to kind of track everything that's happening or with allocated funds. So that's just on a very tiny local government level. So thank you so much for sharing. And if anyone else has anything to add.
I was
If
just gonna say
not,
that even when you make it available online, you still get people who are questioning where the money's going. So there's still, this education
very true.
component.
Yeah, very
But
true.
what you said was right. Is like even then, the majority of people are happy with, or I wouldn't say happy. They're okay with the tax. But there's some people who are just not.
Very true. Okay, Dr. Powell, I think I'm going to throw it back to you. Thank you, everybody, for participating, and thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, you hit all the major points of the article, and I think that it is interesting to think about local government finance in the wake of all these different characteristics that the author speaks of. And as you talked about globalism, and some of our future articles, when we talk about current and future issues of import to federalism, we'll also talk about globalism. But I think globalism is kind of a double-edged sword for local governments. While on one side, all of these international agreements, international trade agreements, and perhaps even international climate agreements, they are kind of beyond the control of local governments, and they impose another level of mandates and orders onto local governments, even above and beyond the what they get from state and national governments. And so, from that perspective, it can really kind of put local governments in more of a box in terms of a lack of flexibility. But on the other side of the coin, it allows local governments to engage in international dialogue and international discussions. And we've seen mayors, and we've seen this here in LA. We saw Mayor Garcetti do this. We've seen previous mayors do it as well, where they'll go overseas and they will talk to representatives from China and from other nations to kind of come up with trade agreements and come up with understanding for how trade should occur and to try and help grow the economy of the city. And so I think it does place them in a box, but it also provides them with some opportunity for those types of negotiations. The characteristic that really hit me is this idea of technological advances. I think everyone did a really nice job of talking about that. But we do have in a lot of our states what I think we can consider to be antiquated tax systems. Most of our tax systems are what we call a situs-based system, which means that they are based upon where the transaction occurs or where the economic behavior occurs. And today, as we know, a lot of things have migrated online. We also know that there's a lot of on-demand corporations where corporations no longer keep a brick and mortar inventory. They are creating product on demand. And so because of that, governments may lose out on property taxation. And you can no longer have those inventories that you used to be able to tax. And so that's something that local governments are going to have to catch up to. I think we also know what has happened with e-commerce, and it's interesting. This article was written in 2003, so here's a good example of updating the article. When the article was written in 2003, most state governments did not have access to apply their sales tax rates to e-commerce. They were still living in the world of Quill versus North Dakota, which said that you had to have a physical presence nexus between the company and the state in order to be able to tax transactions conducted by that company. Today, we're living in a post-Quill society where we had the Wayfair case a few years ago, which essentially opened the door to states applying their sales taxes to e-commerce. And so I think that some of the arguments, e-commerce types of arguments, have changed a lot as a result of the Supreme Court decision in the Wayfair case. Back when state governments did not have access to taxing e-commerce, All states that had a sales tax also have a use tax. And so if they couldn't apply their sales tax, they will apply their use tax. The problem with the use tax, obviously, is that very few people report their use tax obligations on their state tax forms. And so collection rates are very, very low for use taxes. So I think the moral of the story here is that state governments and local governments really need to update their tax systems to keep up with a more mobile consumer, with a more mobile e-commerce type of purchasing patterns. The aging population argument that Michelle mentioned and several people participated in the discussion on, that has profound implications as well. If you are a local government and you are primarily reliant upon the property tax, if you have an aging population and a majority of your population above the age of 65, they're going to have exemptions from property taxes, and you're not going to have full access to the normal assessed value of property that you would have with residents who are below the age of 65. And so that has an impact upon reducing the amount of property tax revenue, perhaps, that you will be able to generate as a local or a state government. I forget who, I think maybe it was Josephina, someone mentioned the idea of the impact of an aging population on schools and the funding of schools. That's a major problem for school districts because as your population ages, that aging population is less likely to support property tax increases for the purpose of K through 12 education. So I think the moral of the story here is to try and address these challenges. State and local governments really have to take a very critical view of their current tax structures and update and modernize those tax structures to move away from situs-based taxes and to be able to capture this economic activity that's going on online and crossing state boundaries, and to try and capture that as a source of revenue, which they haven't really been able to do, at least up to the Wayfair case in 2018. The final article we have for tonight is the Nivola article, The 10 Commandments, Federal Prescriptions, and City Problems. And this is a good article to serve as a segue between our discussion of fiscal federalism tonight and then our discussion of the administrative aspects of federalism that we will have next week. It's kind of like lives in that in-between world between fiscal federalism and administrative federalism. And I think the article's title is a good title, this idea of 10 commandments, because the commandments, the orders, the mandates that are given from the federal government to state and local governments, they can be more tense and more fraught for certain governments as compared to others. I think one of the morals of the story here is that different local governments are different. There's just not one type of local government. We know that we have one national government, we have 50 state governments, and we have well over 10,000 local governments in this country. Those local governments can be cities, they can be counties, they can be school districts, they can be regional water districts. So there are a lot of different permutations of local government. Federal orders and federal mandates may have more of an impact on one type of local government as compared to another type of local government. And as I'm sure you're probably well aware of, there are two basic categories of local governments in this country. There are general purpose governments, and then there are special purpose governments. So general purpose governments are things such as cities and counties. They provide a lot of different services across a range of spectrum of different types of services. And so those are your general purpose types of governments. Then you have your special purpose governments that provide services in one given policy area. So school districts provide services in terms of education. Sewer districts provide sewer services. Regional water districts provide water distribution. And so those are your special purpose governments. General purpose governments have a lot more flexibility and latitude and autonomy than special purpose governments have. General purpose governments can be charter governments. They can have a lot more control over how they conduct their elections, whether they are a strong mayor or a weak mayor form of government. They have a lot more control over their budget, how they raise money, how they spend money. And so general purpose governments have a lot of flexibility. Special purpose governments do not. You think about from the perspective of a special purpose government like a school district. School district is under the auspices of the State Board of Education and the Superintendent of Public Instruction at the state level. At the county level, that school district is under the auspices of the County Board of Education and the county superintendent, but also under the auspices of the County Commission on School District Organization, also under the control of the County Board of Supervisors, also under the control through COVID of the County Department of Public Health. And so special purpose governments don't have the same flexibility and autonomy as their general purpose counterparts. And so a mandate that may not have as much of an impact on a general purpose government may have a very significant impact upon a special purpose government. And that's where it becomes more tense in terms of the relationship. The author kind of presents to us this backstory of what happened to our major cities in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the early 90s. And what was happening was this donut effect whereby we had more affluent residents choosing to move out of our cities and move into surrounding suburbs for a variety of reasons. Why did people choose to move from the central city into primary and secondary and tertiary suburbs? What was drawing people to the suburbs? What did people think they would get better services for in the suburbs as compared to the services they were getting in the city?
Well, if it's anything of what we are experiencing now is an actual home that is a bigger home, bigger yard, maybe safety.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
It's
You
cleaner.
Yep, it's cleaner, it's safer, you can get a bigger yard. Anything else?
Some of these suburbs are new, or at the time they were newer, so the services were better.
Yeah, the services are better. Your infrastructure is newer, and with newer infrastructure, you have fewer failures than what you are going to see in terms of the infrastructure in an older city. You know, your storm sewer system is probably going to be newer, and so it won't be having the failures that you oftentimes see in cities. So absolutely. Schools, people oftentimes move to the suburbs anticipating better schools than what they had in the city center. So we had a lot of these things that were drawing people out of the cities. This whole idea of people moving from the cities to the suburbs is really predicated on this idea of public choice theory. And you may be familiar with public choice theory. Public choice theory essentially says that different governments offer different bundles of services. And so you choose then the bundle of service that you prefer. This kind of goes back to an economic theory of what's known as the mobile consumer thesis by someone by the name of Charles Thibault. And I'll put his name in text chat. But Charles Thibault in his mobile consumer theory says that every city provides different bundles of goods and services. And so therefore people will vote with their feet. And so if you like the bundle you're getting from city B better than what you get from city A, you'll then move to city B, and so on and so on. And so the argument here is people were moving to the suburbs because they liked the bundle of services that the suburbs were offering as opposed to the city. And Josephina, you're right. It is very similar to the idea of white flight, because the people who are moving out of your city are oftentimes the people who have more of the financial wherewithal to be able to do that. And that's the problem with the mobile consumer thesis. The mobile consumer thesis does not recognize that different people have different abilities to vote with their feet. And so some folks have the ability, if they have more disposable income and they work a job where it's much more remote in nature, or they have a car that they can drive to get to work, then they have the ability to then move out to the suburbs. If you don't have the car and you're relying upon city buses to get to work, you're going to be much more restricted in terms of where you can move. And so I think one of the problems with this mobile consumer thesis is that the people who were moving out of the cities were your more affluent residents. So as these more affluent residents move out of the city, they kind of hollow out the tax capacity of that city because they take their tax capacity with them when they move to the suburbs. So at the same time, you have your more affluent residents moving to the suburbs and therefore reducing the tax capacity of the city. At that same time, you're also changing the demographic of the citizens who are living in the city. Your citizens that are then the less affluent citizens who are staying in the city, and those less affluent residents then will probably be placing more service demands on the city than their more affluent counterparts. So you kind of have this double whammy that cities are being hit with. They're losing their tax capacity at the same time that demand for city services, those demands were increasing. So you had less revenue, but you were being expected to provide more services. And that's kind of the situation that Nivola paints for us for major cities like Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, especially these Rust Belt cities in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the early 1990s. When I was in graduate school, I worked with a faculty member named Mike Pagano, and he was responsible for every year putting together what was called the Fiscal Survey of Cities. And that was something that he did for the National League of Cities. And so for a couple of months out of the year, graduate students would essentially be chained to our desks, and we would be going through the data and helping prepare this Fiscal Survey of Cities. And one of the things that we saw in this Fiscal Survey of Cities is that there were differential impacts between metropolitan areas. Some cities in the 1990s saw a big recovery in terms of their tax base. We saw a lot of revitalization projects in city centers, and some cities actually started doing a lot better in the mid to late 1990s. But some other cities did not, and some other cities were still dealing with the same type of flight that they were dealing with for the previous 3 or 4 decades. So not only do we have the difference between general and special purpose governments, but we also have cities that are experiencing this white flight and experiencing this loss of revenue in different ways. And so Nivola says that when you have cities that are experiencing this loss of revenue, any types of commandments, any types of orders or mandates that they get from the federal government are going to place a bigger fiscal burden on them than on other cities that are not experiencing that same loss in revenue. So I think one of the big takeaways of this article is that the impacts of mandates, it's not uniform, and that different governments experience different impacts from these mandates. Mandates, these commandments, as Nivola kind of in a pejorative way refers to them, these mandates oftentimes tie the fiscal hands of cities by requiring the cities to spend money in certain types of areas. And I think Nivola makes a very compelling point when he says the type of government, especially in urban areas, that is oftentimes most harmed by these commandments, by these mandates and orders, are school districts. Urban schools were the ones that really took the brunt of what we refer to as this process of shift and shaft, that the federal government would shift responsibilities onto these local governments, but then give them the shaft by not fully funding these mandates and these orders that they were placing upon local governments. So whenever you have these unfunded and these partially funded mandates, those unfunded and partially funded mandates tended to hit those urban school districts harder than any other type of local government. And again, I think the reason for that is because these school districts are special purpose governments. They don't have the independent revenue generation ability that a lot of general purpose governments like cities and counties do. They're in most of our states heavily reliant upon money that they are getting from the state for their basic aid, and then heavily reliant upon the federal government in terms of trying to help pay for special education programs. And one of the big problems for a lot of these urban districts were those special education programs from the federal level. The special education programs being handed down from the federal level obviously were worthy. They obviously were something that needed to be done. The problem was that the federal government was reimbursing these special education programs at about 25% of their total cost. So 75% of the cost of these federal programs that local school districts were required to engage in had to then be covered by the local school district's money. And this is in my school district, what we refer to, I think I mentioned before, is the special education bleed, in that we had so much money going out of the general fund to pay for the special education programs because we were not getting reimbursed for those programs from the national government. And because of that, then the opportunity cost meant there were fewer things we could pay for outside of special education because so much of the general fund was going to make up for the amount of money that the federal government was not giving us for those special education programs. Well, so what? The big so what here is that if your urban school districts are some of the most vulnerable, I'll use the term vulnerable types of government when it comes to these federal mandates, the more federal mandates you have, especially unreimbursed federal mandates, the worse your schools are going to become. And then what happens? The worse your schools become, then exactly as Reggie said, you have a drop in arts, you have a drop in music programs. You're not able to provide those types of programs anymore. You're focusing more on reading and writing and the things you're being held accountable for by the state. And what it ends up meaning is that your schools then have a worse perception among the public. And the public start talking about how the schools are getting worse. And then we know one of the main reasons why people leave cities is because of the quality of schools. And so it's kind of this tautological type of argument in that it makes the schools appear worse. And then you lose even more of your affluent residents to the suburbs, which then reduces your taxing capacity, which then reduces the amount of revenue that you have to then try and make up for the lack of reimbursements for special education programs from the national government. And it really kind of becomes this never-ending cycle that these urban school districts fell into, and many urban school districts are still suffering from. But I think the major takeaway again from this article is the differential impacts that federal mandates may have. And some of these mandates, some of these commandments can be much more tense for some types of governments as compared to others. And so it's not a monolithic one size fits all approach. I think that's an important point for us to carry with us into next week and our discussion of administrative aspects of federalism. A lot of the articles that we will talk about next week bemoan the impacts of mandates, especially unfunded and partially funded mandates. We have to realize that those unfunded and partially funded mandates are going to have differential impacts depending upon the type of local government that they are affecting. So it kind of creates a nice little frame of reference for us to understand a lot of the articles that we have for next week. And speaking of those administrative articles, you want to really tighten your seatbelt a little bit because we've got a lot of articles in the administrative section for next week. Scheduled for next week, we currently have 8 articles that are scheduled. So even though tonight's session is kind of a short one, next week I think will be a much longer session. So be prepared for that. We have the techniques of intergovernmental relations, politics of unfunded mandates, another look at bargaining, American public administration, homeland security, federalism by waiver, medical marijuana article, and then the intergovernmental relations future, does anyone really care article by Jonathan Walters. So those are the 8 articles that deal with the administrative aspects of federalism. And what kind of ties those articles together really is this idea of mandates and orders. The federal government issuing these mandates and orders requiring state and local governments, especially local governments, to take certain types of actions. So whereas this week we look primarily at grants and aid, next week we're going to look at the impacts of mandates and the differential impacts of those mandates on different types of local government. Are there any questions or observations at all on either the Nivola article or any of the articles that we have covered tonight under our discussion of the fiscal aspects of intergovernmental relations? Again, I think the, oh yeah, a quick question. Go ahead, Reggie.
I'll speak instead. It's a lot easier. Just really quick, I wanted to check the syllabus I have. I have medical marijuana the week of the 24th. Am I incorrect?
Let me check I think that on the spreadsheet we have it on the 17th.
Okay.
Honestly, we may not get to it on the 17th, to be quite honest with you. 8
Okay.
articles, that's a lot for one night. So I would say plan for it on the 17th, but it may have to slip to the 24th.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Sure. And then, we'll play it by ear. We'll see how we do. If we have some articles left to cover, then on Saturday, the 27th, we'll go ahead and have that session and finish up those articles and kind of put a bow on everything on that day. But we'll play it by ear and we'll see how far we get next week and then how far we get on the 24th with our future and current issues and trends in federalism and intergovernmental relations. Okay, if there's nothing else, that's all that we have for tonight in fiscal federalism. Again, I always encourage you to do exactly what you did tonight, which is to take the conceptual theoretical information from these articles and then apply it to the practical world of public administration. Again, want to commend everyone. I think that's really important that you're able to point out different types of grants that you use and kind of find where they fall in terms of, are they categorical grants? Are they block grants? Are they a project-based grant? Are they a formulaic grant? Do they have matching components to them? And the ability to kind of take grants that you deal with and you're familiar with and kind of know what type of grant they are now and why we have that type of a grant, I think is really what we are looking to get out of tonight's session. Okay, if there's nothing else, then we will call an early evening tonight. Again, remember to do your Canvas discussion board number 4, along with 2 responses, and that's due next Tuesday. The next Wednesday, we will cover those administrative aspects articles. We'll see how far we get, and then we will play it by ear and take it from there. Okay? All right, everyone. I hope you have a good remainder of your week, and I'll talk to you again next Wednesday. So take care, everyone.
Good night, Dr. Powell. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, Dr. Powell. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Hey, Dr. Powell.